This week on The Record, we count down the top 10 political stories of 2025. From St. Louis Public Radio, political correspondent Jason Rosenbaum. From the University of Missouri-St. Louis, political science professor Anita Mannion. The final record of 2025's Year in Review is coming up right now. Welcome to The Record. I'm Mark Maxwell. 2025 was a year of transition and disruption with rapid changes that tested institutions at every level of government from Washington to City Hall. So now in our Year in Review, political science professor Anita Mannion and veteran political correspondent Jason Rosenbaum both join me to help us count down the top 10 political stories that reshaped power, trust, and accountability across the St. Louis region. Let's kick it off, guys. Coming in at number 10, Senator Dick Durbin is stepping away. He spent decades as one of the most powerful Democrats and many years as one of the most powerful Democrats in the nation. Durbin's decision not to seek re-election signaled the end of an era for him and kicked off a high-stakes succession battle. Jason, Dick Durbin's 81, but he sits on a judiciary committee across from Chuck Grassley, who's 92, 93, I think. How much do you think the shadow of President Biden's defeat and the broader age debate within the Democratic Party factored into Durbin's decision here?
It probably factored in a little bit. I remember talking with Roy Blunt when he decided not to run for another term, and he basically was like, I don't want to spend my 70s in the Senate. And while he didn't say this explicitly, I think he saw how some of his colleagues just stayed into their late 80s and 90s and deteriorated. And, you know, I'm sure that Dick Durbin has fine genes that will allow him to live until he's 110, but I think he wants to do other things in his life. And, you know, you can't say he's had an unsuccessful career given that he's been reelected to the Senate pretty consistently, and the race to replace him will certainly be worth watching.
And we will get to that, and we'll revisit the Dick Durbin impact in this last year in 2025 on some other big issues in Capitol Hill later. But let's go right to number 9 for relief for victims of radiation exposure. Congress passed an expanded RECA bill in 2025, and for the first time, people in our area saw checks of $25,000 and $50,000 showing up in their bank accounts. These are widows, surviving family members, and survivors of radiation exposure themselves. Anita, we're calling this one of the top stories of 2025, but really the legislative fight stretched back many years. Even last year in 24, Senator Josh Hawley tried to get RECA attached to the defense spending bill. It failed then. Why do you think RECA finally broke through now?
Yeah, this has been an interesting fight where you've seen Just Moms really relentlessly fighting for this and partnering with, you know, politicians as far apart as Cori Bush and Josh Hawley. And so finally St. Louisans are getting relief. I think part of that breakthrough was leverage in the Big Beautiful Bill Act and other states that were also putting pressure on the administration for this change.
It was interesting to see at that press conference when they announced it, Josh Hawley gave Cori Bush, not Wesley Bell, credit for getting that done. They were both standing there in the press conference, and you can read into that as much as you'd like. Let's keep moving, though. We're going to go at a rapid clip here as we start out number 8, the data center uprising. It started out as kind of quiet economic development deals, but they quickly became some of the loudest political fights of the year as data center proposals raised alarms over water usage, transparency, pollution, and corporate influence. Jason, why do you think data centers became such a flashpoint compared to other ordinary development projects?
Because they're associated with artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence regulation is going to become the biggest issue nationally in the next 5 years. I actually decided, after being very anti-AI, almost stridently, to use Google Gemini a lot more this year, primarily to edit a novel I've been writing since I've been 18 years old. By the way, publishers, if you want me to send it to you, this is my opportunity.
Shameless plug.
And I found it to be somewhat useful, but not useful enough to upend the entire economy and to potentially have all this environmental damage. And I think a lot of people from both sides of the political spectrum really have a lot of questions about AI, and data centers, I think, go hand in hand with that skepticism.
A question about trade-offs. We know what we're losing. We don't yet know what we're gaining or how to define that. Anita, do you think that local governments were caught off guard or maybe underestimated how much residents would push back here?
Yeah, I think that's particularly true probably in St. Charles, where you know, it is a more Republican, conservative leaning, usually less in favor of regulation, and those residents push back really hard on that. And of course, we've seen it in St. Louis City and other areas as well.
All right, we're going to move on to number 7 here as we go down our top 10 list, the state takeover of the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. Missouri lawmakers moved to return control of the SLMPD to the state, reopening that long-standing debate over local authority, public safety, and accountability. Anita, former Mayor Tashara Jones managed to block this takeover for years, all the way up until she couldn't. Republicans argued that the move was really necessary to describe what they saw as social justice-minded Democrats trying to defund the police. How much of this would you say was really about crime policy? How much was about politics and symbolism?
Yeah, I think that, Tashara Jones made the argument that the crime argument was sort of undermined by the fact that St. Louis City's crime rates have been going down in recent years. And when you looked at Kansas City, who is under state control, there wasn't, some markedly, they're doing great and St. Louis is really struggling. This is a very unusual situation. St. Louis and Kansas City are now the only major metropolitan police departments in the country that are not under local control.
In the last few seconds before we go to break here, Jason, you've covered the legislature for a long time. You saw Police Chief Robert Tracy testify. Violent crime was already down. Lawmakers either didn't accept that or didn't believe him. And then almost immediately after Governor Kehoe gets his political wish through, you saw some national networks come to town and say, look, crime's trending down right after the state takeover, as if one caused the other. What does that tell us about how this fight was framed from the beginning, and who's ultimately getting credit for the reduction in crime here?
Well, I'll give you another example. President Trump was thinking about sending National Guard troops into St. Louis because the CEO of Union Pacific was saying it's unsafe. And I guess they were trying to make the argument that it was the Democratic mayor that was responsible. But in a weird way, they were saying that the state control had backslid so much in like 3 or 4 months that they needed to bring in the National Guard, which clearly wasn't true. And I think that was more of like Trump and his people didn't know the situation. I think it's going to be a couple of years before we know whether this works or not.
A lot more to get to. Up next, a federal indictment rocking City Hall and a partisan power play at the president's request. Our countdown continues right after this. Welcome back. We continue counting down the top 10 political stories from St. Louis in 2025. Number 6 is the expulsion trial of Sheriff Alfred Montgomery and the federal felony indictment that followed thereafter. It was a dramatic saga that actually started on New Year's Day 2025, right when Alfred Montgomery was sworn in, and followed up with a swirling list of headlines, scandal all the way throughout the year. I should note, we're having this discussion, Anita and Jason, just a few days before we expect the final decision from the judge about whether or not Sheriff Montgomery will be expelled. So this is almost certain to reach our viewers and air after that case has been decided. With that in mind, Jason, where do you think Sheriff Alfred Montgomery, a young sheriff, went wrong?
Thinking the office had more power than it did. One of the reasons why it was hard for me to get super enthusiastic about this story is the sheriff's office in St. Louis has such limited duties. You're supposed to guard the courthouse. You're supposed to serve people for evictions and a couple of other things. And I think that he tried to make it more than what it was. And then when people were trying to say, hey, previous sheriffs have, drove people at the Justice Center to the hospital, and we expect you to do this, and he got indignant about it because of monetary concerns, I think people were sort of like, well, you're doing all these other things, including buying new uniforms and golf carts and badges, which it's more within his purview to do, but he wasn't taking care of things that I think were seen as really important. And then obviously the thing that has really caused potentially his downfall was handcuffing Tammy Ross when he clearly didn't have the right or authority to do that.
There's doing the job, and then there's the representation of who you are in the job. And I think the symbolism and the timeline was interesting because we saw the state come after Kim Gardner. We saw the feds indict the husband of Cori Bush, and she lost her race there. There was a question of outsiders coming after Cori Bush. These were prominent black leaders. And then here you had a lot of people in the St. Louis area who saw the feds bringing a black sheriff, into court in chains in custody of U.S. Marshals, and felt a certain kind of way about that. In fact, we heard from the defenders of Alfred Montgomery say, this looks racist. But Anita, his predecessor, Vernon Betts, never faced that kind of criticism. The person following him, Yosef Yasharallah, and the person following him, John Hayden, all black men. Tammy Ross, a black woman in this. So where do you draw the line between the duties of the job and then the symbolism of that state versus our leaders in the city discussion that St. Louis has grappled with for a while?
I think in several of the stories that we're going to talk about today, there is this kind of looming question of should maybe more conservative white legislators in Jeff City be stepping into issues that people might think are a local control issue in a 50% black Democratic city of St. Louis. So I think that is sort of a question that looms over a lot of these issues. But to your point, this is about particular behaviors. So when we're starting to hear about golden dice and burner phones and handcuffing the jail director, you start to wonder, is this an episode of The Wire, or is this what's happening in St. Louis, right? So it seems to me that there are legitimate issues that are being questioned here.
There's an idea. We can bring it from Baltimore to St. Louis. All right, let's break into our top 5. Jason Rosenbaum can break down this next story better than anyone. The map wars. Missouri lawmakers redrew political map lines at breakneck speed, reshaping districts in ways that diluted Democratic voting blocks and locked in that advantage for partisan gain well before voters could respond. They did so at the specific request of President Donald Trump and over the loud objections of thousands of protesters who packed the halls of the state capitol. Jason, this very same 7-1 partisan map was rejected under Governor Parson just a few years ago when it was actually time to do the maps, but then it passed under Governor Kehoe. What changed?
Donald Trump knows that he will likely lose the House next year, and they needed to think of some alternative strategy, which was doing this mid-decade redistricting push. And I think it's really backfired objectively. Not only in Missouri, where there's a referendum campaign that may prevent this map from going into effect in 2026, but also the fact that California voters basically canceled out Texas. Virginia is probably going to cancel out, let's just say for the sake of argument, Missouri stays. Missouri, North Carolina, and other states.
So all for nothing.
It's all for nothing, and frankly, the thing I thought through most of this craziness, which is still ongoing, is even if Republicans had an advantage in the redistricting wars, if they get crushed in places where they can't change the maps, like Michigan, Arizona, Pennsylvania, and maybe some other states, Oregon and Washington have Republican Congress people that could lose. This whole thing will be for nothing, and I think it's very possible this map that I've spent a lot of time on and you've spent a lot of time on may never go into effect, especially if it's voted down in what's looking like an inevitable referendum that is entwined in this endless morass of litigation.
There you have it, a similar vein of thought coming up next. What happens when lawmakers challenge the will of the voters and the election that reshaped St. Louis politics? When we come back. Welcome back. Coming in at number 4 in our year in review top 10 political stories this year, Missouri Republicans moved to weaken abortion access and paid leave benefits after voters approved both of those items at the ballot box. Anita, we've seen the party in power reject or override the will of the voters in Missouri before. Was there something deeper or different about this case?
Well, the state legislature has been frustrated by the initiative petition process because over the last 7 or 8 years, lots of things they didn't want to happen through that process. Expanding Medicaid, raising the minimum wage, legalizing marijuana. And so the one power they do have, if things are passed by statute and not constitutional amendment, which is what happened with the paid sick leave, then the state legislature can reverse that. And that's what they've done in this situation, which is why most of our ballot initiatives are constitutional amendments. And then in the case of the abortion amendment, obviously that's something the state legislature doesn't favor. And so now they're saying we're going to put that back on the ballot with some reframing that voters will have to sort through.
A big fight to come. Jason, quickly, do you think Missouri voters will ever again change the state constitution?
Yes.
Yes, okay. That leads us to our next question. Our third top story of 2025. Kara Spencer defeats Tashara Jones for mayor. What do you think was the real turning point in this race, Anita? Policy, personality? What do you think was the biggest driver of this outcome?
I think it was some policy, it was some personality. Tashara Jones had a couple things happen where timing was the issue, so it happened very close to the election, like trash removal and snow removal issues. And I think, so that's the policy part. I think the personality part is how she responded or didn't respond for a while to those things. And so I think a lot of times when residents are frustrated, they want to feel that they're being heard and know what's going to change to make it better. And Tashara Jones was sort of stubborn about that for a while and then came out and said, yeah, well, we did a pretty good job, but we hear you now. So I think the timing and personality.
And Jason, do you have any sense of how much this result of this election reflected broader voter frustration beyond just the city hall and the mayor's office?
Ooh, that's a good question. I do think the fact that Tashara Jones, who won the mayor's race based off a multiracial coalition in 2021, basically her white support collapsed, and frankly, for a black candidate, her percentages on the north side were not that great. And I think Kara Spencer did better in African American wards than even Mayor Slay did. And I think that really signified a real tension between constituents about the state of city services. It remains to be seen, though, whether that can replicate itself in 4 years.
All right, our top two still ahead. Washington shuts down, St. Louis feels it, and the storm that changed everything. Our top two stories next. Welcome back. We continue our 2025 year in review with Jason Rosenbaum and Anita Mannion. Good to have you both with us this week. Our second top story of the year, the longest government shutdown in American history. Dysfunction in D.C. hit home hard, stalling courts, freezing benefits, impacting universities, inspections, and disaster recovery. All of it wrapped in one. Senators Dick Durbin and Josh Hawley both emerged in central and highly visible roles in policy fights over SNAP, Medicaid, the future of American healthcare policy. Anita, we talked about Senator Durbin's departure, but even in one of his final acts, he negotiated a deal with Republicans to reopen the government and to preserve a political issue he thinks is a winner for Democrats in the midterms. How do you see the way Senator Durbin impacted this big government shutdown in starting it and in ending it?
Yeah, so the Democrats really were focused on the fact that the Obamacare subsidies were going to go away, and they wanted to keep those. Also concerns about Medicaid, other healthcare stuff. So the Democrats think that's a winning issue for them, and they think that it affects their constituents. And so here, Dick Durbin was one of a handful of Democrats who went ahead and voted to end the shutdown. I would note that not only was he not running for office, but everyone who voted either is not seeking re-election or is not up for re-election for at least 4 years. And so sort of folks who were protected went ahead and made that vote.
They're not feeling the pressure of impending politics. Jason,
right.
You've covered Senator Josh Hawley for a long time. 2025 might have represented his most rapid evolution on healthcare premiums, on SNAP, on cuts to Medicaid. He sided with Democrats. He broke with his party to stake out a more compassionate lane that would support the social safety net that often Democrats support. What did you learn about Josh Hawley in this government shutdown fight?
I think that he is certainly an interesting person to cover because I don't think he is a guaranteed vote for a lot of things. Eric Schmidt pretty much is. Eric Schmidt is clearly trying to position himself in a J.D. Vance administration. I mean, I don't think that's a secret. I think they're really good friends too. But I think that Josh Hawley is a smart person and he knows that Donald Trump is not going to be around forever. And I think he needs to find a way to distinguish himself compared to all the other people that want to succeed him. And I think he's trying to do that by triangulating a lot of issues that have some resonance with Democrats.
Interesting analysis. Our top story in 2025 struck St. Louis on the afternoon of May 16. Yes, it was a weather story at its heart, but the tornado of 2025 tore through neighborhoods and exposed systemic failures in emergency response, insurance delivery, recovery, and it turned a natural disaster into the defining political story of the year. To both of you, Kara Spencer ran for mayor promising to improve the speed and quality of city services, but just 1 month in, the most basic city service, the alarms, didn't work. This many months later, what's your sense of where voters place the blame and responsibility for that blunder?
Oh, man. I think that's just part and parcel with a lot of things that went wrong with this storm. But namely the fact that, a third of St. Louis was destroyed by it? Maybe less than that. But, I mean, I got to tell you, Mark, when I went and saw the damage in western and north St. Louis, it looked like bombs had gone off. And the fact that especially there was not an immediate and more serious federal response, I think is the biggest indictment or the biggest example of what Donald Trump's impact on this country has been. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not trying to say that he shouldn't have called an emergency declaration in Kentucky right away. More people died there. But anybody who would have seen the damage would have said this needs to be an emergency declaration the day after. And it took 3 weeks, 4 weeks, which is actually quick in government terms. And then FEMA came here, and honestly, when you talk with the mayor's office, they found it to be very underwhelming. Now, your question was about Spencer. I think that she will face some criticism for not being able to deliver more to people that are asking for a lot. But I think she's correct in saying that the city cannot do this all alone. The state has stepped up by providing money. I think the defining aspect of this story, and why I think it's the biggest story of the year, is that I think the federal government has objectively failed at helping in the response. And I think it's going to be something we're going to have to follow for years to come.
We saw varying degrees of response from Congressman Wesley Bell, from Senator Schmidt and Hawley, and still more funding to come perhaps. But that's all of our time for now. So that's our show. Until next year, we're off the record. Thanks to you both.